There we go. All right. Thank you, Jane. One just news flash in that, I'm not retired yet. No, I decided for some unknown reason to stay on working. Why would I do that? And took on conference co-chair. So we are looking for volunteers. I'm not to talk about that, apparently. I only have 15 minutes, right, Jane? 15 minutes. So, good morning. It's my pleasure to talk to you about another great moment I had while researching my maternal ancestors. And funnily enough, all my interesting stories seem to be on my maternal side, so I'm not sure why that is. Most of you may know my mother, so you're not a surprise. So also, there are lots of children this time, and just a warning up front. Not nearly as many as the last time, though. So I don't know who was here in December of last year. I talked about the Thorne family and their 20, 30 kids, whatever. Yeah. So not so many this time. So I'm going to talk a bit about a family called the Kuehl family. I have troubles with that name, so I'm not going to say it an awful lot, fortunately, during the presentation. Forward. So the Kuehl family, it was specifically the woman in the family that I'm interested in, which is Mary Ann Flannery. She's my second great-grandmother on my maternal side. And we had the following information when I took over and started looking into the records. We knew she was married. She married a gentleman called John Kuehl. We had the 1881 and 1891 censuses, and we had a death registry. So the numbers in brackets represent sort of her year of birth, if you like. So we had some troubles, as you can see, trying to determine sort of exactly when she was born. This is not uncommon. Especially with women, their ages seem to change as you go from census to census. They're all 10 years apart, but the ages change. But they were consistent that she was born in either Ireland or Dublin, Ireland. So that always creates a problem. Okay? So this is a copy of the marriage certificate. So we did know a little bit about Mary Ann's father. We know from this marriage certificate that his name was Patrick Flannery, and he was a soldier. Not that useful. We didn't do any research into that because all we knew was he was a soldier. So just briefly going through here, we had the 1851 census. You can see Mary Ann listed with looks like a bunch of children, listed as being from Dublin, Ireland. I got to talk close to the mic, apparently. All right. The same for the 1891 census. She's listed at the bottom here. So just as a recap, so give some more of an idea of what Mary Ann was like, life was like. She got married in 1865. She had 12 or 13 children at the time, and then she passed away in 1895, I guess. So after about 30 years of marriage. The one that was a puzzle here was Olive, because I knew there was an Olive born in Southampton where they were living at the time, last name of Kuehl. There were a number of Kuehls living in the area, so I wasn't sure she was part of the family I was interested in. She fit nicely into the gap, but still wasn't sure. And then just this November, so I guess it's sort of a little brick wall. This November I was reading John Reed's blog. I thought I'd plug his blog as well. Some reason and he's indicated in his blog that the GRO had now put their indices online that included the mother's maiden name going back to 1839 when they first started. So by quickly looked up Olive, and sure enough, her mother's maiden name was Flannery, so I added her to the family. So there's now 13 children. And just as a history in terms of what John was a cartman, which means that he was basically a delivery man, and so they were not particularly well off, and still had 13 children. And I'm descended from Lily, who you see there in 1880. So why was I interested in Mary Ann Flannery? Well, there wasn't a lot of information about her, therefore she's a challenge. She came from Ireland. And I just kind of wanted to know where she was before 1865 when she married John Kuehl. And how did she get from Ireland to Hampshire where they were married? And of course, who her parents were. I mean, I knew about Patrick, but didn't know anything else. So the question became, what was behind the brick wall? So I started searching initially by going through and verifying the records, and did that because I purchased an Ancestry subscription. That's a plug for Leslie, but I see she's not here. And started checking out all the ancestors and verified the 1891 census as well as the 1881 census and the death index. And then I located the 1871 census, which is here, just by doing a search for Mary Ann Flannery, or Mary Ann Kuehl in this case. So fewer children, but she's there. She still says she's born in Dublin, in Ireland in this case. So did another search on Ancestry looking for Mary Ann Flannery and found the following. So what we have here is the 1851 census. That's strange. That's quite a bit of time before I knew she was in Hampshire. And the census is one of Mary Ann Flannery, highlighted with the green arrow. She happens to be with her mother, who's listed directly above her, of Anne Flannery. Well, I didn't know that. Who is listed as a widow of a soldier in the 3rd Buffs. And above that are her grandparents. That was easy. Back 2 generations, just like that. With her mother's name as well. So I know mother and father and where she was in 1851. Well, brick wall solved, right? I'm done. Next. So if her mother was in Hampshire and her maternal grandparents lived in Hampshire, was it possible that she was married in Hampshire? Because that would make sense. And sure enough, she was. So I went and did a search for the marriage certificate and found Patrick Flannery marrying Anne Blake. It's the right one, apparently. They got married in Gosport. And now I have the name of Patrick's father, John. He's a carpenter. And I could see the name of Anne Blake's parents, James, and he was a laborer. The other interesting thing about this one is it confirms, because it's very difficult to read, of course, but here, under the profession, it says he's a private soldier with the 3rd Buffs. So that got filed for a while, because we always working on other things and get distracted on our family trees. And then I was at a BIFHSGO, I'll plug BIFHSGO here, a BIFHSGO meeting, and someone mentioned that the military records could contain a lot of information. So I thought, oh, military records. I have a soldier. Maybe there's lots of information about him. So I decided we would do that. But I did some research just on Google, looking at the 3rd Buffs. So this the uniforms of the 3rd Buffs over the time. I have to admit they're quite stylish. Anybody would like, someone dressed in one of those. So there's the 3rd of Foot is the name of the regiment. They're from Canterbury, Kent, in England, called the 3rd Buffs. And they were in India from 1827 to 1845. So the question is, how did Patrick join them? And where did he end up? So to solve that riddle, we hired a researcher in 2010 to look into the military records of Patrick Flannery in the 3rd Buffs. This was done because the records are in Kew and they're not online. The result was a number of pictures we got back of Patrick's military record in the 3rd Buffs. And this one that I'm showing you here shows that he joined the 3rd Buffs from the 16th of Foot in December of 1839. So that's okay, so that I know how he got to the 3rd Buffs now. But he joined them from the 16th of Foot. So here's a picture of their uniform. I think that's more their dress uniform. I doubt if they actually wore that into battle. It'd be pretty scary with those tails. Anyway. So we went back to the researcher and said, okay, well, now we know he's in the 16th of Foot. Can we find out the records from that period? And I'll get back to Patrick in the 3rd Buffs a little later on. So I'm sort of working my way back, and then we'll come forward to his time in the 3rd Buffs. So here he is, volunteering from the 16th of Foot. So the record starts on the upper left, where it's his name's Patrick Flannery, highlighted with the arrow, and then he's volunteered to the 3rd Buffs. So they have a number of different ones in terms of what the records look like. So this is like the header page. It tells you that he was in Bengal and the dates that he was actually serving. So, and they have these like every month, basically, they tell you where he was and where. So you can make a sort of plot of how he traveled around. Go on to the next one. So here he is again. Now I know this one's from the 16th of foot because his number here is changes as when he goes into the third buffs, he gets another number, and he actually carries both numbers forward. So in this case, it's March. Here it says he's on the river. I'm not quite sure what that means. Here it looks like he's on the march, and then he's joined back into the regiment on March the 8th, 36. So it's really specific as to where he was, what he was doing. So this is, oops, how can I get blank? There we go. So here his list of this is when he actually came to England, or to India from England. So it turns out that he did his initial training in London, and then he was sent to India as a replacement soldier for the 16th of foot. So he left the dates are important here, because he left June the 15th, 1835 on the Exmouth. And here, the vertical line here tells me that he arrived on November the 13th, 1835. So yes, it took him 5 months to get to India. Hopefully not on that one little boat the whole time. So in this particular case, this is his enlistment record. So if I go on here, I'll highlight the section on the right-hand side that says he's a recruit. He showed up, recruited on the 24th of September, 1834 in Athlone, Ireland. He was Irish. And he spent some time in the hospital when he first joined up. That's this, there we go. We go to the next one. This is the little part here. He spent some time in the hospital. We're not exactly sure. It doesn't say, of course, just that he was there. So that was his duration in the 16th of foot. So he signs up in 1834. He goes through training. 1835, he gets shipped to India. And in 1839, he transfers to the third buffs. Probably because he wanted to stay in India. The 16th of foot at that time was coming back to England. They were being recalled. So my guess is he wanted to stay on. He liked India. So in the third buffs, he came back. So the third buffs was recalled in April of 1845 back to England. So this period I'm kind of really interested in. So this is kind of a synopsis of what he was doing. They returned in April. He marched from Chatham to Winchester through the city of London, which was a historic right to march armed through the city of London. In August of 1835, he was court-martialed. 1845, he was court-martialed. There's no indication as to why he was court-martialed, but he spent, must have been a fairly serious offense because he was in jail until February of 46. I suspect they got a new command. The third buffs got a new commander when they came back to England. So my guess is things have been slack in India, and the new commander wanted things done a certain way, and maybe Patrick wasn't quite conforming to what he should have been doing, because he was back in jail again in April of 1846. So he hadn't learned his lesson. That's a common theme actually further through his career. And then the third buffs left for Dublin in October of 1846. So they were basically in England for 18 months. And oh yes, by the way, he got married as well in that period to my third great-grandmother, I guess, in September of 1846. So shortly after they were married, in September, he would have gone over to Ireland, and I presume she followed. So this is an example of a regimental pay list. So this tells you what the soldiers were paid. In this particular case, we have Patrick down here at the bottom, and in August of 1845, and he's not paid because he's in jail. So for the next 5 years, Patrick spends his time in Ireland. He appears to be on police duty. Probably related to the famine. I mean, they went over in 1845, which is in the middle of the famine. He was posted to a number of sites around Ireland, and he had a number of furloughs, which is like time off. which the researchers suggested was related to the birth of his children. However, they didn't really line up with Mary Ann, which was somewhat strange. So I'm not sure how that fit in, because the dates I have for Mary Ann don't fall into either of these particular periods. He ended up in hospital in 1850, the fourth quarter of 1850, and he passes away in 1851, early in 1851. So this is his last entry in terms of the regimental records. You can see it's listed across the bottom here. It tells me where he was born, Shrewell, Ireland, which is really nice. When he was a laborer when he enlisted, the date he enlisted, how he became non-effective, which I think is a rather interesting term. He died, which would tend to make you not effective, I believe. And he passed away in a place called Birr, which is the military, one of the big military centers the British Army had in Ireland. And the date that he passed away. The rest of this line tells me that his deceased next of kin was unknown, which I find rather strange since he was married and presumably his wife was living with the regiment or close to the regiment. His last known place of residence, which is a place called South Bourke, which I have yet to find, and the fact that he actually owed them quite a bit of money. So the amount of debt is listed here as being 5 shillings and 6pence, and that may not sound a lot of money. That's about £200 today. It's a sum of money, but it doesn't sound so bad. But you have to realize that the soldiers' pay was about nominal pay was 1 shilling a day. Okay, so he's only 5 days behind. Not too bad. But there was a decrease. It was decreased by something called stoppages. So of up to 6pence or half a shilling a day for their daily rations. And that was just daily rations. And then there might be other stoppages for things like replacement clothing, damages, medical services, of which he would have had some, and so on. So in reality, he was probably roped in there for some time. So I don't think he was getting out. And it was changed in 1847 so that the soldiers had to receive at least 1 penny a day after all the stoppages were taken off. So you got 1 penny a day, he's quite in debt. So this is where Patrick was in Ireland. Just one thing on that previous slide. He dies the end of January 1851. By the March census of 1851, his wife is back in Southampton. So 2 months later, she's back in Southampton with what is then her 2 girls, aged 3 and 1. So this is a map showing Ireland, obviously. So Patrick's born in a place called Shrewell, which is here, and he signs up in Athlone, which is here, and then he goes to India. He comes back into Dublin, and then marches around. He goes spend some time up here in Northern Ireland, near Belfast, and then he spends some time down around Limerick, where his second daughter is born, and then he spent some time here, actually quite close to where he was born, and then ends up dying here in Birr, which as you can see is really sort of the geographical center of Ireland, which is why the British built their main compound there. And when I talked to one of the people in Ireland at a research center, they suggested that they like to march the soldiers around a lot to keep them busy. And so they'd move them around about every 6 months. And that just about corresponds with Patrick's moving around. That's in 5 years, he's on more of Ireland than most of us have. Probably not in a good way. Okay. So this is a picture I found on Google. I know it's not appropriately cited, Marty. I'm sorry. I couldn't change my presentation in time. So this is Private John Connor of the 3rd Buffs, and it was taken in 1850. So my assumption is that Patrick would have had a similar uniform. It's kind of cool looking dude. Well, he's trying to look cool. I'm not sure he quite gets there, but he's trying to look like he's really debonair or something like that. So this is the picture of the cemetery in Birr at in Crinkhill, which is where the British Army base is. I'm not sure Patrick is here, but my guess is if he was buried as part of that cemetery, he would be in this area here, which is where the cemetery stones were dated around the 1850s. I recently came across a burial of a Patrick Flannery in a Catholic cemetery, which does make a little more sense, about 30 kilometers away. The year was off by 1. But anyway, I need to look into that a little more to see. They may have put him there instead. When I tried to contact the local Catholic parish in Burr, I didn't get a response. So just to wrap up, in terms of Anne Blake, who's Mary Ann's mother, March 30th, 1851, she's back in Hampshire, living with her parents. December the 31st, 1851, she remarries a gentleman called Henry Wiedler, who was also a laborer. And then she dies in 1889 in Hampshire. So Mary Ann, this is a gentleman, she married a carter or loader or census cartman. That's just a gentleman here, John Kuehl. They had 13 children in 30 years, and she passed away at the age of 49. We don't have a picture of Mary Ann, obviously. Her obituary states at the bottom that she's a beloved wife and she's dearly loved and sadly missed by her sorrowing children. Don't see many of those these days. I'll write them that way. So John actually ends up remarrying as well. He had all those children. He needed somebody to look after them. And John actually passes away in 1932. Sorry. So the last thing I did was was searching, as I often check all the sources again and again for something new that's come up. And I came across in Family Search website a transcription of a baptismal record from Mary Ann Flannery. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. So I decided I would have a look at that, and it looked like my Mary Ann Flannery. So I went and got the record, which is really important to do, because the transcription looked nothing like this record. First off, there was a whole bunch of stuff that was just wrong. So it's here. So Mary Ann is spelt incorrectly, spelt as one word. Well, maybe not incorrectly. It's not the way it has been spelt in the future for Mary Ann. The parents are listed as Anne and Patrick, Patrick without a K, also a bit of a surprise. The father's name was listed as Blake, which is Anne's maiden name. So this is obviously not correct. The place of where they were living, which I believe is where Anne's parents were living. He was listed as a laborer in the original transcription and the original registration of the baptismal. So there's obviously a bunch of things wrong. But there's a nice big note down the side here. So there's that, and here's the note, which you probably can't read. But what it says is that the notation here states that the father's trade was changed on presentation of Lieutenant Charles Hood on the 2nd of January, 1851 to the minister. It also appears that to me, that's basically what and it says who Charles Hood was from the 3rd Buffs, and so on. So it appears that they also changed the surname, obviously, and the father's name was changed. So it really was all wrong. But it raises a number of questions for me. So why change the record? Because, I mean, it was all wrong, obviously, but how did they know that it was wrong? So Patrick dies in January of 1851. The record, the end of January. The record's changed the beginning of January 1851. So what was Charles Hood doing, Lieutenant Charles Hood doing in Hampshire in 1851? Well, it may have been a letter, so that somebody suggested that maybe they should wrote a letter. And I know Patrick's illiterate, so he might have got his lieutenant to write him a letter to ask them to change the baptismal record. But then how did he know it was wrong? And presuming that Anne, his wife, told him, how did she know it was wrong? So I'm still working on that. So what's behind the brick wall? Obviously, more brick walls.
In my mini biography, it mentions the fact that my parents are from the Eastern Township. So this is a story that takes place in Quebec's Eastern Townships. in the Sherbrooke area. So I'm not sure if anybody out there is researching that area, but it does take place. I see one hand over there. That's lovely. My father comes from a family, all of his grandparents' names start with D. So the Davises came from England in 1870. The Deardens came, it was a combination of Deardens and Glendennings, and they came to Montreal in the 1850s. And the Doyens are the American ancestors who came up through New Hampshire and Maine, etc. But there was one family line that I didn't know very much about, and that was the Dohertys. So when I started to do some research, I came across an entry in the church registries that caught my attention. The first one that caught my attention was one for, and we'll just move forward here on it. So I was reviewing the church registries, and I was doing it in a sequence. I was reading through them every page by page to see who I could find in there that had the name Doherty, or any of the other relatives I was looking for at the time. And what I discovered with the Drouin collection, and I'm not sure how many people are using these to research, on the end of a lot of the each book has an index at the back. So that's good. You can go in and look for the various names that you're looking for. But one of the things I had learned at one of the BIFHSGO meetings is that when you look at an entry, you need to look at who else is in there. So who's the godparents, the godmother, the godfather, who witnessed it, depending on if it was a burial, etc. So I came across this entry, and it was for Olive Grace Doherty, and it was in 1898. And in that registry, and maybe hopefully you can read a little bit. You'll see partway down that there's the name Charles Doherty, and he was a laborer. So this Grace is born of this legitimate marriage between Charles Doherty and Susanna Gormley. And so I thought, that's very interesting. That's great. I know I have the right family. And then I noticed that it says the godfather has been Philip Thompson, laborer of this parish, and the godmother is Anne Thompson, his daughter, who could not sign. And it says the father was absent. So a couple of those things are really interesting, like why was the father absent? And I've noticed a number as I've gone through that the father's absent. Well, he's a laborer and he's working in different locations. And as you do the research, you find out that some of the families would travel, some of the men in particular would travel into the States to do work, and then they'd come back. So seasonal workers, really. So, okay, so I see Philip Thompson, and I think, oh, that's a neighbor or that's a friend. So I take note of that. And as I carry on through, in 1901, I find an entry for Charles Doherty. And you can see that, so there's two entries that are of interest on this page, in the center on the left and the bottom one on the right, which carries on. And so the first one was for Charles Doherty, and there's an interesting word added to the margin, drowned. So that immediately caught my attention, Charles Doherty. So he's my father's, let's see, how does it go? So he'd be my third grandfather, whatever, but my grandfather's grandfather kind of thing. So two generations back beyond my dad. And so this caught my attention because if you read it, it says that basically it was on the 11th of July, 1901, that they interred his body in this parish. And so it was called St. Louis de France was the cemetery, and that's the church in East Angus, Quebec. And it says that the body of Charles Doherty, laborer, husband of Susanna Gormley, so again, I know I have the right Charles Doherty, deceased at Brompton Falls as certified by the coroner's certificate herein annexed on the 6th instant. So he died on the 6th of July, aged 50 years and 3 months. Great clues to go back and find him in the records. And present at his burial was Susanna Gormley, his wife, his children, and many others, among them the following who have signed. And so if you look below, there's the signature of Frank Doherty and James Doherty. And as it turns out, those are two of his sons. And they're about 20 at the time of his death, or in their 20s. So that was very interesting. And I thought, wow, you know, no wonder I don't hear much about the Dohertys. And one of the complications for Dohertys in our family is, for the most part, we see ourselves, we don't see ourselves, but for the most part, all of my ancestors are Protestant. And this is the one Catholic family in my ancestry. And maybe it has something to do with that, you know, I know a lot about my mother's side of the family, and I know some of my father's side. but maybe the fact in the end, Charles's daughter Marianne marries my great grandmother. She marries Dearden, Edward John Henry Dearden, and they're buried in separate cemeteries. So again, and this is in East Angus, and they are buried in cemeteries that are probably half a mile apart. So I think this is where some of it comes from. So it's been fun to explore this Doherty and Gormley family, these Irish ancestors. So on that same page, I said there were two entries of interest. The first was Charles Doherty, who's listed as drowned. And the next person who's buried on the next day is Philip Thompson. Well, Philip Thompson was in that first baptismal record that I saw, and I thought his friend died at the same accident. It gives the same kind of detail that it was at Brompton Falls. And if you notice at the bottom again, one of Charles's son, James, signed as one of the witnesses. And one of the things that to note in here, and I'll tell you a bit more about it, is I don't see mention of Philip's widow mentioned in there, versus Charles's widow as well is mentioned twice in the entry, and there's nothing about Philip's widow, and we'll talk briefly about that. So that gave me, I thought, okay, what do I do next? How do I find out about this? Because that coroner's certificate that says that it's annexed was not in the records, that in this parish record. So I didn't find it. So I thought, okay, where am I going to go? And at the time, this is a couple of years ago, I was looking and I wasn't so familiar, and I'm still learning on how to use the National Archives of Quebec. And I recently went back in searching and used different methods to find that coroner's certificate, and I didn't. So that's still out there. And the records from I have to say that the records from the Sherbrooke area are pretty messy or very thin compared to what I found for other areas of Quebec. So this is a map. Sherbrooke is in the middle of here. So it's in the eastern townships. It's about just over an hour's drive to the east of Montreal. Brompton Falls, I don't have it exactly along the St. Francis River, but it takes place in this area in general. And East Angus is where the two men are from. The two of the men, there were 4 men who drowned that day, and we're going to talk about that. So I had to find out where it was. I've gone there many times myself, not to Brompton Falls, but to the townships, and I'm familiar, but I didn't know where Brompton Falls were. So this is what I found when I went in looking for old newspaper records. It always is something, and again, very fortunate that there's a lot of Sherbrooke record. In this case, it's the Sherbrooke Examiner. There's a lot of information on there that you can find that's been posted when Google was doing their projects to get many newspapers up there. So I discovered that not only had 2 men drowned, but 4 men drowned. And also, there were 5 others, and it says 5 others have had a narrow escape. Bodies were carried over the falls, and the men have been engaged in log driving. So this is on July 8th, 2 days after the incident happened. So I'm just going to read you a couple of quick excerpts from the actual newspaper accounts, because they sent a reporter out, and he did a great job in capturing sort of what was happening. It says one of the most sad drowning accidents which ever had been known in this district occurred Saturday evening at Brompton Falls, when 4 men lost their lives by drowning and 5 others had a narrow escape. What adds to the sadness in the fact that the accident did not occur while the men were following their hazardous occupation, but just had completed a hard day's work as they were returning across the river. So again, think about the work that they were doing. And if you want, it's kind of, the log driver's waltz is out there. Have a look. It's quite good. Actually, the National Film Board version is quite good. And you'll see the men running across the logs. Because it's a short presentation today, I didn't share it with you. But please take a look if you're interested. So it says a representative of the Examiner, so the newspaper, the reporter, visited the scene of the accident this morning and gleaned the following facts. For 2 days previous to Saturday last, about 40 men were employed by the Royal Paper Company of East Angus in clearing the rocks and banks of the St. Francis River of the logs that had been carried down the river during the high water of a few days ago, following one of the biggest storms that had been experienced in the upper reaches of the river. The fatality is a sad sequel to the storm, which will long be remembered in this section as one of the most serious for a long number of years, and also for the fact that several lives were lost. So I did a bit of research about Brompton Falls, and apparently they've changed the river. I don't know if they've dammed it up somewhere, so I don't even have a photo to show you of what the rapids would have looked like at the time, because the landscape has changed slightly. So there's more description of what went on, but I'll read you about Charles. Charles was accompanied by his son, a young man of about 20. and one of those saved. The father was a splendid swimmer, and he was observed for a few minutes after the accident breasting the current in a grand style. His son, who was in a somewhat calmer water, called on to his father to come his way, and he was then observed to turn on his back with the intention. It is believed, in the intention it was believed of husbanding his strength. While the men were watching him, he suddenly sank. And so he disappears, and his body's not found along with the other 3 bodies for a number of days. And so I went on and I found other accounts from the newspapers, and I even went back in again these last couple of weeks. And it says on the 12th, again, this is a biweekly, the Sherbrooke Examiner again, and on the 12th, as of the 12th at noon, the bodies of the 4 drowned men at Brompton Falls still had not been found. And yet we saw that the burials took place on the 11th and the 12th. So I don't know what that means. Did they? I don't know. Maybe I can find that. So then I thought, maybe there's even more records in the newspapers because, and yet it turns out that drownings were, and I don't have the exact statistics, but when I looked around, almost like every other death that was happening at that time was a drowning of some sort. It was amazing the number of people who drowned during that period, whether they were in Canada or probably around the world. But even the States, I was finding those numbers, lots of deaths by drowning. So the fact that there were 4 of them made it newsworthy rather than one person at a time. So it was in the Gazette, and they also reported, I've looked in some of the French papers, and I found different things. So the names are not always consistently spelled. We're going to talk about that briefly. And then the other thing that I found is that some were saying that it was Philip's son, but it's not Philip. It was Charles' son who was in. They were saying that he was trying to save his father. So again, the newspaper records are not always consistent. So if you look at that, the 4 men were Charles Doherty, leaves a widow and a large family in East Angus. Philip Thompson, or P. Thompson, leaves a widow and a family of 6 in East Angus. J. Labrie, single, belongs to Point Levy, and George Wardle, single, belongs to England. So those are the 4 men that drowned. So here's what they were trying to do, was to return after the hard day's work, return across the river to a camp. These photos, Marnie, I don't have them, the information. But these photos, I do have them in my notes, but these were photos that were taken in the Outaouais, the Gatineau area in the same time period, around 1900. So it just shows us what, it could have looked like for these men. So for George Wardle, it's in the newspaper accounts, it's Wardle. So, but then, and I couldn't find anything. He was a soldier. He had served, and he was from England originally. And here he was working as a laborer. But lo and behold, I found him in the census records, and I was so relieved because I started to go through looking for him, and I just thought, this poor young man, needs some kind of record to say he existed and a part of the story. And it turns out he's 26, I believe, and he died he was born the 5th of December. And he had come to Canada. I guess I could look here where I can see a little closer. But just what was important is that we just were able to put him, he was living as a boarder with another gentleman and with a widow and her children. It looked like she was a widow. But so he existed, and I created a tree for him on Ancestry. So someday I'll do a bit more research on him. But again, there's the spelling differences, Wardle, Wardell, whatever it is. Now, Joseph Labrie is interesting because my mother is a Labrie. I'm all excited. I go to my grandfather's book. He's got hundreds of names in it. He researched the family from when they arrived from Quebec to his present day at that time. And there's no Joseph Labrie. Well, Joseph's an interesting name in Quebec because it could be his baptismal name. And what was his, did he have another name? So when I looked it up, I didn't find a Joseph Labrie in my grandfather's book, and I didn't find it in the census. I haven't found the man. I found a family of another spelling, closer to Labrie, the second spelling of Labrie. So I don't know who Joseph is. Someday, maybe we'll find Joseph. But just a couple of quick things about Charles and Philip. So I thought they were friends. But when you look at it, they are both children of Irish Catholics, and they were both born in St. Sylvestre about a year apart. St. Sylvestre is south of Quebec City, and it's an enclave where half the population at that time were Irish Catholics. There were Protestant Irish there as well, and there were French Canadians. But the bulk of the people living there were Irish Catholics. And you'll see that Charles is the son of James Doherty, and Eliza Doran, another D for my dad with all his D names. And then Philip was the son of James Thompson and Bridget Doherty. Aha! So I got all excited when I saw that, and I thought, they're cousins. But I have gone back, and I've been doing lots of research, and I cannot prove what their connection is. I am sure they are related because it seems that their families came over. Of the James and Eliza were both born in Ireland. We think it's in Donegal. And then James and Bridget. James is born in Ireland, and Bridget was born in Lower Canada at about 1820 or so. So could it be that those Dohertys, one family came over before the other and they had their children? I don't know. I'm going to see what I can find out. So there's Susanna Gormley, and she's listed as Susan, Susanna, et cetera, throughout the record. And again, she's Irish Catholic as well. And then Philip has married Mary McCullough. She dies, and then in 1898, the same year that Philip witnesses Grace's baptism, he remarries in September. He's a widower, and he has, at that time, he had 8 children. So this young woman, I believe, Denise Morissette, marries Philip Thompson. But I found the 1901 census records for both of these men. They're still alive. It's April of 1901, and they both drowned in July of 1901. But Denise Morissette is not living in the home, or she's not reported as living in the home with Philip. Maybe 8 children of a widower was too much to handle, I don't know. And she remarries in the next year. By January of 1902, she's remarried. And so both of the men, Charles left behind 10 children were living at home. Marianne, his eldest child, my great-great-grandmother, was married by that point and had her, some of her children by then. And they're buried in the same cemetery. I went there 3 weeks ago. I found the Dohertys. I found the Thompsons. I don't find anything specific to the 2 men, but I found their children, and we're going to say that's where they're with their family. So I'm just going to leave you with a few last little details about Arthur. Was the son that was in the accident. He goes on, 2 years later, he moves to the United States. He lives in a place called Berlin, New Hampshire. He works and lives there for the next 40 years of his life. His body is returned, and he is buried in the same cemetery with his family, and I found that marker when I was there 3 weeks ago. You'll see his signature is down here. This is actually from 1902 because both Charles and Philip, Charles's mother dies in 1902 and Philip's father dies, so the survivors. But this is interesting because you have Arthur Doherty down here who signs. He survived that, so for 40 years. There's also some kind of census or draft records to say that he had lost his right hand. He was being drafted, and we were talking about that this morning, for the First World and the Second World War, but the poor man had lost his right hand at some point. So Arthur's here. Marianne is listed here as Mary, his daughter, and again, the great-great-grandmother. There is Susanna, his wife, who's still alive at the time. And I like this slide very much to see all those different family members. Many of those are his children who signed after his death. And this is another one that's going to be a mystery for the future, is that one of the ancestors is a Hahi or a Fahey. I don't know which it is according to the signature, so we'll see what comes up. But that's it. So I just wanted to share Charles's story with you. Okay. Yeah. You want this now?
But anyway, I'm going to show you this first thing to get going here. The top there, that's my family. James Wright and Maria Gerard came to Canada in 1832 with 8 of 10 children. They had 2 children after they got here, and I'm not going to show you all those children because they're not relevant to the story. The fellow over on the left is my problem, but we'll get to him in a moment. I'm descended from Henry in the middle. Okay, I should have drawn a little line there. Henry married Catherine Smith, and my great-great-grandfather is Daniel Wright, and we'll meet him later on too, and it comes down to me. The point being was, of the 10 children in the family, I researched all of them back in the 80s, right down to the present day, including a fellow who lives around the corner from me who's a cousin, except for the fellow on the left, William P. Wright, born about 1823, was all I knew at the time. So I've got my fellow up there, and I've got Sophia, their younger sister, who married a man named Erastus Jackson, and they had a son named Lyman Jackson, and they were the owners and editors of the Newmarket era newspaper from about 1854 until the 1930s. But my mystery man, of course, is William P. Wright. I looked for him everywhere back in the old days. The Wellington County Atlas, published in 1906, said that he had settled in Pennsylvania. Now, before the internet, with a friend of mine, we spent a week in Salt Lake City in 1990, and we searched the records of every state around the Great Lakes, especially Pennsylvania. But William Wright is not a very good name to be searching, believe me. So with the internet, of course, the same kind of thing happened. It's a very difficult name to research. Lots of William Wrights. The same story. There were lots of possibilities, but there was no way that we could confirm that William Wright was my William Wright. And in fact, it got so frustrating, I brought out the heavy equipment. It wasn't any good in this case, but if we're doing exhumations for DNA, it might be a possibility here. So it got the kind of thing, and after a while, I had 9 of 10 done, and William P. Wright, I sort of left him to one side, and there were days when I felt like cutting him out of the tree altogether and just leaving him to one side. And I thought maybe that would be the easiest thing to do with him. I was never going to find him. So I'm going to switch gears now to the Newmarket era newspaper. Years ago, I traveled to Toronto on a regular basis, and I would slip into the archives, and I would start looking at the Newmarket era newspaper. They're all related to me, Erastus and his son Lyman. And I started reading the social column. Of course, not knowing where the paper was going, I restricted myself to the society column, which was page 2. And I started to pick up stories about the Wright family. Of course, remember, they're all related. And so it wasn't unusual that Erastus and then his son would report on the Wrights. And of course, Lyman's mother was a Wright. So all kinds of things turned up. And I was very fortunate. Family events. And what I did, because I didn't know where I would be going with it, I picked certain years and certain events. So if it was a marriage or a death or other life events, then I zeroed in on the newspaper, and it became a veritable archive of Wright family history. References to family members far and wide, not only in Ontario but in other provinces, again, because they were related to the Jacksons. So it was a real treasure trove of information. Connections between families, who was visiting who. Up there in the top corner is when my double great Daniel Smith married Josephine Lundy in 1878. Erastus carried a little story about that because he was obviously at the wedding. Down here, my great-great-grandmother, who was living in Coburg at the time, indicates that she traveled around the province visiting her sons. Okay, and actually at the time, I didn't know where these two fellas even lived. Okay, so the newspaper told me where they were. There's my great-great-grandfather was a tinsmith, and there was a really delightful ad from the late 1880s in the era newspaper. In 1894, he took the family to Carberry, Manitoba, thinking it would be better for them. And of course, he wrote to his cousin. His cousin was the editor of the paper, so he would write to him and say, gee, things are really lovely out here in Carberry, Manitoba. So Lyman very kindly printed his letters in the newspaper. And you know where this is going, folks. Just hang with me. Now, even what happens here, even some longer notices. This is my 3 times great-grandmother, Mary Wetherall Lundy. He carried quite a long obituary for her in 1906, which was a real treat. My great-great-grandmother lived in Newmarket up until about 1911, and I knew that they had moved to Toronto. I knew at some point they moved because she's in the 1911 Toronto census. But then she was selling her house here. She's selling all the furniture, and in fact, again, remember they're related. He actually indicated the day on which they moved to Toronto. Okay, they've left Newmarket for Toronto. And of course, I also found my grandfather grew up partly in Newmarket, and he wrote to it would be his uncle, Lyman, and there's a letter I found from my grandfather who wrote to the paper during the First World War. And that's really the only document I have from my grandfather in that term. So All this was really wonderful, and then what happened, after I'd been through about 50 years of this paper, it was digitized. It went online. And there it is. So anyway, what do? Well, I didn't redo what I'd already done, because I had a couple of books of notes. But of course, I'd skipped some dates. I zeroed in only on where I thought there might be events of relevance to the family. So I looked at my index, and I thought, well, okay, now I'll just go back and fill in the gaps of those dates I didn't look at. And if I put in the name right, I was doing 1 year at a time. You can call up the newspaper 1 year at a time, and you can search 1 year. And I was getting for Wright's probably about 75 hits for a year. There was a fellow who lived in Newmarket. His first name was Wright, and he was on the local council, and he came up all the time, not related. But anyway, there I was late one night a couple of months ago, and I'm just going through the newspaper, picking off the Wrights and checking them off, and then I found what I didn't believe. William P. Wright of Bowling Green, Ohio. Brother of Mrs. E. Jackson, arrived here on Tuesday on a visit. He left yesterday with Mr. and Mrs. E. Jackson for Zephyr Villa, where the latter have gone for the holiday season. Zephyr Villa is a cottage on Lake Simcoe, at Orchard Beach. That was June 1903. William P. of Bowling Green, Ohio is 80 years old, and he's visiting his sister in Newmarket. So I kept it up a bit, and sure enough, 2 years later, Lyman ran a column called The Tomb, and there he was. That's okay. The births were called The Cradle, and I won't tell you what he called the marriages. So anyway, he runs this little thing that William P. Wright died. He died at Bowling Green, Ohio on November 3rd, and he again indicates the relationship, that he's the brother of Mrs. E. Jackson. So as you all know, when you find a little bit of information like that, it opens a door, right? So I immediately went to the U.S. Census for 1900, and there's William P. Wright, born in September 1823. He claims to have been married since 1882. He entered the U.S. in 1840 when he was only 17. He was naturalized, it didn't say where, and he was a painter, And I thought, well, that's all kind of neat. That's more than I knew an hour ago, So anyway, what also came up on Ancestry was this delightful thing. In 1890, there's no American census, right? It was destroyed many, many years ago. But what has survived are the veteran schedule, and there he was. A breakthrough moment, as far as I was concerned. His name was found in the 1890 veteran schedule to the census that was largely destroyed. It names the unit that he served with in the American Civil War, the 16th Ohio Infantry, and the date of his enlistment. Now, I would have been happy to stop there, but of course we don't do that, do we, folks? And I found a website dedicated to the 16th Ohio Infantry, and it gave his age. He was recruited at Ashland, Ohio on April 23rd, enlisted a few days later. He became an ensign in Company B. Now, he was discharged 90 days later at Columbus, Ohio. At the beginning of the American Civil War, in some states, it was felt that the war was going to be over very quickly. So people were allowed to sign on for 3 months. And at the end of 3 months, they could either stay in or get out. And he did. He got out. And I thought, well, that's still a pretty good story to go home with. But for some reason, I went back to the Ancestry listing for 1890 veteran schedule, and gall darn if he wasn't listed twice on a separate document. And this was a big surprise because he re-enlisted. He had re-enlisted a short time later with the 1st Ohio Light Infantry. And so again, I had to go and search what that was all about, and I found a roster. And here it confirmed William P. Wright. He was an artificer. He enlisted on September the 9th, 1861, for 3 years this time. He was discharged, however, at Columbus, Ohio in November 1862 because of an unnamed disability. There's no evidence that he applied for a pension, so I'm not sure exactly what happened there. That doesn't concern me now. But now, of course, I can fill in a lot more about him. He was once lost, but now he's been found. He's at the Oak Grove Cemetery in Bowling Green, Ohio. Further information has not been found. I cannot confirm him in any earlier U.S. census, but it appears that he did marry when he was 58 years old. He married a Canadian woman in Detroit, Michigan. I think it's him, but I'm not absolutely certain. So a mystery remains, but after searching for 25 years, at least I know something of his life and times. And there's my good cousin Lyman. He's actually a first cousin 3 times removed. Lyman died in August 1934, and eventually the Newmarket Era newspaper passed to other hands, but I certainly have a lot to be thankful for. So you probably think that I might be finished with newspapers, but actually that's not the case. Here we have Henry Wright marrying Catherine Mary Smith. They both born in 1828, and they both died in 1900, about 6 weeks apart, actually. Their firstborn son was Daniel Smith Wright, who married Josephine Lundy in 1878. I showed you a little clipping earlier. Now, there are a lot of Lundys in the Aurora, Newmarket area north of Toronto. It's quite a large family. And actually, those 2 fellows over there are her cousins. Oops, I turned it off. At the punchline. Anyway, a little larger, John? Okay. Give me the last slide. There we go. I don't own the digging equipment, by the way. That just happens to be it. I wish I did. No, one more. No, one more. There we go. These 2 fellows over here are cousins of hers, Horace Dean Lundy and Sylvester Lundy. Why are they important? They owned and edited the Aurora Banner newspaper for 35 years. From the 1870s right through until they died. They died almost together in 1915. So I think they're third great uncles of mine. So I think I'm going to be reading the Banner newspaper from now on. And actually, I think that's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Sixth-generation Montrealer, and she has a BA and a Master's of Applied Science in Clinical Psychology from McGill. She worked in that field for over 3 decades, relocating to Halifax in 1990, but she retired in the late 2009 to Ottawa, where some of her children and grandchildren live. Her father conducted family research for over 30 years with great enthusiasm and persistence. And Suzanne shares her father's love of family history, but takes particular pleasure in the assembling of historic family portraits and photographs to supplement the who begat whom. So today, Susan will share the story of her family's newly discovered cousin Dave, the living legacy of their family's loss in the First World War. So please give a warm welcome to Suzanne Eakin.
My name is Suzanne Eakin, but my maiden name is Mathewson. And my dad, as Jane mentioned, did genealogy for about 30 years during the era before Ancestry.com. And unfortunately, he died just the year before we made this discovery of the war baby. But he would have loved it. I'm just going to give you a little context. What you will see is a video that was actually made by the BBC. So it's family pictures, but made by the BBC. It's a little more tolerable. It just goes on for about 8 minutes. So I'll just give you a little context. And because this was all unknown to us until 2014, there are 2 sides of the story, one in Canada from our perspective and one in England. And the 2 parts didn't know what the other was about until recent years. So I'll start with my own family in Montreal. And here is the children of my great-grandparents. They had 10 children, and the ones that I have named, Fred, the eldest, is my grandfather, and Kenneth, the one on the left, is one of the 5 boys in the family, and he is the one who died in World War I. They lived in Montreal in this fun old house, which I remember visiting as a child, with the kitchen in the basement and the parlor further upstairs. Sorry, I missed that one. The Mathewsons were Ulster Scots who had come to Montreal. Originally, a brother came in 1821. My direct line came in 1834. And they started a wholesale grocery business. And I think you can see here, it says J.A. Mathewson. The original store would have been in Old Montreal, but they moved to McGill Street on the edge of what was then Old Montreal. And this wholesale grocery firm went on until the 1940s. In the summer months, although they lived in Montreal, they went along the Gaspé, along the lower St. Lawrence, from Montreal to a place that was then called Métis Beach and is now called Métis-sur-Mer. My great-great-grandfather originally went there in 1854, and this was the watering hole of the Mathewson family ever since. We still go there. And this will be of relevance because when we discovered Dave and he came to Canada, I was asked to find a place of Mathewson relevance for us all to assemble to greet him, and I chose Métis. There's the lighthouse at Métis. And there's the family home where the 10 children would have spent every summer of their lives, including Kenneth, the one who died. And that's where we assembled in the summer of 2015. And there they are, the 10 children again, on the porch at Métis, where they spend a lot of time. Oops, I'm going too fast. Of the 5 boys in the family, my grandfather didn't qualify because I gather he had flat feet or something. He wasn't admitted to the military, but 3 of his brothers went, Arthur and James and Samuel, and then the fellow on the right is Kenneth, and he is the only one who died in the family in the war. There he is. He went over with the Black Watch, but then he transferred, like many young daring men, to the flying machines, and he joined the Royal Flying Corps. And he was shot down by a German war ace over France in August of 1916 near Lens, France. And I found this picture online, and I was just horrified at the devastation of the area. And I can't imagine, even if he'd been so lucky to, survive the landing, it would have been a rather prickly landing with all that, destruction of the entire area. And he was originally buried by the Germans, and they misspelled his name, so it took a while to discover what had become of him. But then they found him, and he was reburied in a Canadian cemetery at Boulay-Grenet. And as I said, back to the first picture, he died in August of 1916. The next male child in the family was the son of my grandfather Fred, namely my own father, who, I'm sorry, it's very emotional, this name thing, sorry. His name was Kenneth, obviously, after his uncle, his deceased uncle, and then another child in the family, Winifred. She had a child who was born in 1921, and he was also named Kenneth. She had married a man called Porter, so he was Kenneth Porter. And Kenneth Porter turned 95 2 days ago. He's my godfather. So Kenneth is, from my perspective, a lost great uncle, but he's also the name of my father and my beloved godfather. He's also the name of my brother and my son and my grandson. And so Kenneth, before we knew anything about any of this, I only knew Kenneth as a sort of an iconic figure in the family, who was much beloved because the family was very close and people often spoke about him as the lost son. So that's all I knew about him. There's my father, who was born in 1919. And on the occasion of his christening, his grandparents gave him the christening spoon of Kenneth. And I don't know if you can see very well in this photo, but here it's written Kenneth in the bowl of the spoon. Now this was the christening spoon. I'm going to go again. That was given to my father on the, because it was his uncle's spoon, and he was the first namesake of Kenneth. And this was passed down to me, so I had this spoon, which I valued very much. This is a picture of Kenneth Porter Sr. on the right and his son Kenneth Porter on the left, and they are visiting the grave of the uncle Ken who died. And many members of the Mathewson family have been to Bully-Grenet and visited the grave. Kenneth Porter, the senior, was actually at D-Day himself, so he has been back to France many times. And on every occasion, they always make a trek to Bully-Grenet. So now I will switch to the other side of the Atlantic, which we didn't know anything about this. This man is called Dave Travis. He was actually one of the founders of BBC Essex, and they just had their 30th anniversary. So he's now 63, but he's been doing this since his early 30s, and he was the morning man for BBC Essex for many years. He's now doing the Drive Home show. On air, his name is Dave Monk, but his legal name is Travis. And there he is again on the left, Dave Travis. On the right is his producer. And the woman in the middle is a miraculous woman called Sarah Ensor, who is an archivist at the Record Bureau in Essex. And it is she who tracked Dave down and found him his family. Because Dave never knew anything about his grandfather, other than the fact that he'd been a Canadian airman who had died prior to his father's birth. And I'm not going to go into any more detail at this point because the video, I don't want to spoil all the punchlines, and you'll see it in the video. I do have just a few more slides that, if time allows, I'll show you just 3 or 4, that you'll see the actual pictures of the war baby. But the war baby in question is David's father, and he is the grandson of Kenneth Mathewson. The link is that Kenneth, when Sarah did the research, she discovered that Kenneth Mathewson, our lost great uncle, had fathered a child prior to his demise, and none of us knew this, not until 2014. And it seemed apt that on the centenary of World War I, we would make this wonderful discovery.
I'm finding this quite emotional, I'm sorry, because my father never knew who his father was.
Which is so sad, isn't it?
Because he was too courteous to ask his mother. And my father said to me just before he died, one thing he really regretted was never finding out who his father was.
It's such a
now I
shame,
know.
isn't it?
I grew up not knowing my grandfather. He was never really talked about. I never really asked. But that all changed when the Essex Records Office started to research my family history.
To find out on air was actually surreal. I didn't expect it. It was a complete revelation to me and incredibly moving.
The grandfather I never knew, the man my family never talked about, was Kenneth Mathewson, a Canadian airman lost in action, aged 22, shot down over France in August 1916. He met my grandmother while he was based in England. He went to war unaware he was about to become a father. I didn't have a background before on that side of my family. Now I have. Now I know who I am and where I came from, and that I am a quarter Canadian. It's been 3 years since I discovered my past live on the radio, and now I'm making the first part of a journey I've wanted to make ever since. I finally tracked down my grandfather's grave to a small town in northern France. Lieutenant K. Mathewson, Royal Flying Corps, 3rd of August 1916, age 22. It's my grandfather. I don't know why I bought a picture of my own father here, plus copies of his father's letters. It looks a bit theatrical really, doesn't it? But I wanted to sort of introduce him to his own father, because even up to the point he died, he never knew who his father was, and that was terribly, terribly sad. Terribly sad. I just wish he'd known. 22 years old. What an incredible waste. And so sad that he never knew his child, and so sad for me that I never knew him. He could possibly have been the most ghastly bloke. Who knows? And he could have absolutely hated me. He could have hated his son. Who knows? I mean, just, you don't know. But the sadness is, you never know. You never know. But I think the saddest thing for me is that my father was never able to come and do this. He was never able to come and sit where I'm sitting now. Up until about 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't even know this jigsaw existed, let alone what the pieces looked like. And coming here today has been a really, really important part of putting that jigsaw together. But now I guess there's probably the most important part of the jigsaw still to come. While I didn't know anything about my grandfather, across the Atlantic, nothing was known about me either. Kenneth Mathewson's family never knew he'd fathered a child until I made contact last year. With my wife Caroline, I'm heading to Canada to meet them for the very first time. I'm going to meet these people I've never met before. I don't know what's going to happen, and it's going to be emotional. It is going to be an emotional event. I don't know how it's going to affect me. I'm completely out of control, and that is extremely stressful. Oh, wow, wow. Can we come through? Are we allowed in? Are we allowed in? My father's cousin. How wonderful to meet you.
Just wonderful.
How wonderful to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, it's so nice to have you here.
Come on.
The son that never came home from World War I is coming home.
And it is, that's what it is.
2 generations later.
2 generations later,
It's
the genes have come back.
Yes.
It's fantastic. I started the day feeling very, very nervous. I just feel completely elated now. And you know, this is my father's cousin. My father's cousin.
More to come.
And more to come. It's one of the most emotional journeys I've ever had to make. I've been invited to the small town of Matisse in Quebec, 8 hours from Montreal, the place my grandfather spent his childhood summers. And there's another surprise. He was one of 10 children. I'll be meeting more cousins than I could possibly imagine. We're gathering at Eagle Point, the very place he used to stay, which is still owned by the Mathewson family. Wow. Hello. Hello.
You ever a Matheson?
What do you mean, suave, sophisticated? What? I'm just sorry it's taken me 100 years to get here. Wow. Well, what can I say? How are you?
Hugging.
Hello.
Start hugging.
Hello.
There's a lot of hugging to catch up. And I'm a sister of that one. Welcome,
Hello.
Dave. I'm your cousin.
Hello.
Arthur's.
I'm Rod.
Rod.
We really are.
My
related.
gene buddy.
Great to
My
see you.
gene buddy.
Great to see you, man.
And you.
Welcome.
And
I hope
you.
you're not too far.
In my grandfather's family, there were 10 children, and one of those children died in the war, and his name was Kenneth. And he was very much an iconic figure, and of course, he never came home. It was a very warm and close family of 10 children, and he was always the hole in the family and the tragedy. And to discover just a year ago that he had left behind a child, and that child had gone on to have another child, and that being Dave, and to know that there was a living legacy of this lost son was fabulous. I mean, the whole clan is so excited, and for Dave to come over and for us to meet him and to see pictures that he brought of his dad and how much his dad looks like all the other Mathewsons in terms of his head shape and his hairline and his sense of humor. I mean, it's marvelous. I can't tell you how much it means.
I thought that'd be interesting to compare him at this age, because he would have been roughly the age that Ken was when he died. I still wish my father could have known about all this, because he would have fitted in so well with the rest of the family, because they're all just like him. It's like meeting just lots of versions of my dad, which is, as you can imagine, has been fantastic. I came here for him, to bring him home to this place. Done that now. This is about the future of me as I fit into the family, and they've made it very clear they want me to. And I am a Mathewson, as well as being everything else I am. And that's a good and powerful feeling.
I don't know if you noticed that he shook hands with one man called Rod, and he said, "Oh, my gene buddy." When Dave first was told by Sarah that his grandfather was Kenneth Mathewson, he wanted to verify it and be sure before he got all excited. So he asked if I could arrange a DNA match, and so I asked my brother, who's Rod, if he would do the DNA match. And this was around Easter time, and we didn't get the results until October. And I remember when they came in, and Dave sent me an email say it was 100% match. So that's why he said he was his gene buddy. And let me just very quickly show you a couple things. There is Kenneth Mathewson Travis as a little boy. The mother's name was Connie Travis, so the child was named after the mother and was actually raised by one of the mother's relatives while she went off to Australia. But anyway, and there he is at age 45, and I don't know if you noticed any of the round bald heads in the family, but he fits right in perfectly. And there is a group shot taken at Matisse. But Dave and his wife Caroline had so much fun when they were here, and these are mainly the gang from Eastern Canada. People had come from, well, some from Florida and from the States, but mostly from Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa area, down to Matisse. But there's a whole other contingent of Mathewsons on the west coast of Canada. So this year, Dave and Caroline came back, and we had 3 more reunions. We had one in Edmonton, one in Victoria, and one in Parksville on Vancouver Island. And we just never stopped laughing. And I was a camp follower and went along and to these events as well, because I hadn't met half of these cousins myself. So it was a wonderful opportunity for us to all meet one another. Anyway, thank you.